who were stolen from Africa and trafficked to British colonial America were...
You mean sold? Sold from Africa. They weren't stolen. They were enslaved by their own people and sold. If you're going to race hustle, at least get that part right.
And who bought them again?
First of all, sorry to cut you off, my darling. Love what you're doing. But the first gentleman in your video was absolutely correct. Black people were getting stolen from Africa into slavery prior to transatlantic slavery. Now, let me basically give the facts of what I mean. Elmina Castle was basically built on a piece of land that was given to the Portuguese by a chief at its time called Nana Kwame Ansah. And the reason why this Ghanaian chief gave the Portuguese land was so that they can carry out better trade. Elmina Castle was built in 1741. However, the Portuguese were stealing people from 1731 that they take back to Portugal to teach Portuguese, to bring them back to translate between them and the Africans. These people were enslaved people. That was basically 40 years before Elmina Castle was even built. We also need to take into consideration that pre-African transatlantic slavery did not mean that slavery wasn't taking place. It was being carried out using the indigenous people in the Caribbean, i.e. the Native Americans, the Tainos, so on and so forth. So when they came to Africa from the jump, they automatically knew what they were doing. People also don't take into consideration why Africans were considered to be used as slaves after the Native Americans. It's because there was a Spanish captain with the last name of De las Casas basically went to Africa and saw that people in Africa were digging and mining for gold in the same conditions that the Native Americans were doing in the Caribbean. And because the Native Americans were dying off because of all the disease that they were bringing in and the hardship and so on and so forth, they decided to test a theory by bringing in 150 Africans to the land of Hispaniola. That is Haiti and Dominica Republic today. These people were not sold, they were taken because they want to test the theory to see that if Africans could be used in place of Native Americans to continue their nasty act, which in the end was successful. And that's when they start looking to Africa for slaves. That's when they so-called start buying slaves. Also, what people need to take into consideration is the fact that the term slavery for colonials and Africans were two different things. In Africa, they practiced indentured servitude, whereas in Europe, they were practicing genocide. Pre-colonial period in Africa, you could never tell the difference between a slave and a free man because these people were being taken care of and being cared for by the people who so-called owned them. Slaves in Africa could marry into royalty, they could raise in station, and they could eventually work off their debt and move on. Whereas in the colonial world, it was for life. You were dehumanized, you were robbed of your culture, you were treated like basically an animal. This is why in Ghana today, it's extremely disrespectful to call someone a slave because there could be a chief that was once a slave that rose in station, or somebody's ancestor could have been a chief that was a slave. So when they were so-called selling people, they were selling people to that standard, thinking that is how they were going to be treated.